So yeah, like Julie said, pretty much everybody loves chocolate. Doing events and stuff, I find like 1 in 40 people are like, I don't really like chocolate. So we'll forgive them, but for the rest of us, it's a good day. First I'm going to talk a little bit about Markham and Fitz, our company, and then I'm going to go into some of the details of chocolate making, all the way back from like the origins of the cocoa bean, all the way through the processing of the beans to making chocolate from the cocoa beans. So if you guys have any questions during what I'm talking about, just pop your hand up, let me know. I would like this to be very Q&A instead of just me up here talking the whole time. Because sometimes I forget stuff, and then when somebody asks a question, it's like, oh yeah, I meant to say that. So if there's anything that triggers your mind when I'm talking about it, just ask me a question. I'm going to turn this off because it's kind of noisy, but this is like a miniature, small-scale chocolate grinder that we use for like R&D test batches of chocolate, but it's a little noisy at the moment. So hopefully, yeah, that's a lot better. So Markham and Fitz is the name of our chocolate company. We're located over in Bentonville at the 8th Street Market. So it's kind of a new development on 8th and J. It's pretty much the intersection. It used to be an old Tyson processing plant, and they kind of gutted it and overhauled it, and we share that complex with Brightwater, the culinary school. It's part of NWAC. Bike Rack Brewing has a production brewery there and a tap room. Our neighbors next door is Yayo's Mexican Grill, so they've got some really delicious food. And then there's a few other tenants coming soon. So it's a really cool kind of cultural hub, mostly food-centric. And there's soon to be another version of, or a second Crystal Bridges Museum, like across the field from us, called the Momentary, which is probably a few years out still from completion, but it's going to be interactive and contemporary art. So there's just a lot going on in that area. So if you guys haven't had a chance to check it out, it's really fun. You can kind of walk the grounds. It's beautifully maintained, and you can, we've got our chocolate shop. There's a hallway, and then there's the culinary school, so you can peek in on baking classes or butchery. Sometimes they're carving up whole animals, so it's pretty amazing all that they are putting into this one location. So we opened up there just before Christmas last year, but we've actually been making chocolate for almost 4 years. We rebranded last fall, kind of in preparation for opening up this new chocolate factory / dessert bar, and we rebranded to Markham and Fitz. So Markham is my oldest son's middle name, and Fitz is my business partner Lauren. It's her dog's name. So it's a couple 4-year-olds in our family, and it just had a good ring to it, so we went with it, and people really seem to like it. We started about 4 years ago. We were down in Fayetteville, and we were kind of between Fayetteville and Farmington, and we had a chocolate shop there, but it didn't have a whole lot of like retail presence. And we also used to be a different brand. We were Hello Cocoa. So if any of y'all have ever seen that in the stores, coffee shops or natural grocers or Whole Foods or something like that, same people, new chocolate. It's actually quite drastically improved. We thought Hello Cocoa was pretty good, and we got a lot of good compliments on it, but we realized that after tasting a lot of other chocolate from other chocolate makers around the country, that it wasn't like on an award-winning level. So we bought some new equipment to really improve the quality of our texture primarily and consistency, and that's really up the quality, and the packaging is up to snuff too. In the craft chocolate world, there's quality of chocolate and quality of packaging kind of go hand in hand, and so that was a big importance for us. So I got started making chocolate about 4 years ago. A friend of mine that I lived with after college named Charles, he started a nonprofit a few years ago, and their whole purpose was to do economic development in war-torn countries. And so they did like a daycare project in Iran or Iraq, and that went really well. And then they got connected with a guy at Tyson, and he kind of suggested, hey, maybe we could do something with chickens in an area that needs some, nutritional supplementation to their diets. And so in a random, spirit-led connection, Charles met a guy from Uganda in Branson. And so he ended up going to Branson a few years later, and they met some community members, and they were going to start a poultry farm project, kind of like the heifer project, where you buy a flock of chickens and you give it to a village, and then they grow the flock, and then they give it to the neighboring village, and kind of helps proliferate organically like that. So he and some other members on the trip were in Kampala, Uganda, meeting community members that might be good candidates for being like the first people to receive chickens, who already had some agricultural experience, and they met a cocoa farmer named Cosmos. Although Uganda doesn't have a very vibrant, robust cocoa industry, they do grow a substantial amount, and it's primarily commodity cocoa that is bought by European conglomerates like Nestle and Callebaut and big mass-produced chocolate companies. But this guy Cosmos had some cocoa beans left over from his harvest that the local co-op had met their quota, so they didn't need to buy all of it. And so he had this potential income here, and so he and another guy on the trip were like, maybe we could buy this guy's cocoa beans, and maybe this is another opportunity for economic development. So they bought the cocoa beans, brought them back via suitcase, and just kind of started trying to figure out how to make chocolate. There's kind of a homebrew chocolate community out there. You can buy small scale equipment like this guy, and you can roast it in your oven, and you can buy small quantities of cocoa beans, and just kind of make chocolate on a micro scale. And so they started that, and I got to taste some of their chocolate for the first time, and I was like, oh, this is pretty good. I had never tried craft chocolate before. I'd only had mass-produced, industrialized chocolate, and so there was just so much more flavor in what Charles had brought me, and I was like, wow, this is cool. And I've always kind of been a foodie. Grew up, there's pictures of me in the kitchen, like apparently I could climb the kitchen cabinets before I could walk, so I was always doing something and making concoctions that my mom called them. I would just take spices and liquids and put them in a bowl and put it in the freezer for some reason, but I was like 5, so.
Yeah.
But I went to the University of Arkansas and got my degree in biochemistry with a minor in Spanish. So nothing really related to chocolate making, but it does help to have like a technical approach. But I always tell myself, if I had gone back over, I probably would have studied food science. But it is what it is, and so now I'm a chocolate maker. So I was kind of helping Charles early on, just wrapping chocolate bars and coming up with fun flavors that we could add to it. And so Charles and I, and now my other business partner Lauren, we decided to go ahead and make a business of it. So that's when we started Hello Cocoa back in 2014. So fast forward to now, we've been making chocolate for a little over 4 years. We have a chocolate factory where we produce all of our chocolate from cocoa beans. We also do confections and desserts, so we have truffles and bonbons and cakes and cookies and all those kind of things. It's all chocolate related. We also have like coffee and cocktails and wine, so it's a dessert bar. So it's a pretty fun spot. But that's kind of a little bit of background about Markham and Fitz. So now let's talk a little bit about chocolate making, unless you guys have any questions before I move on. Cool. So cocoa is grown in the tropics, just like coffee, from 20 to 20 north-south latitude. So pretty close to the equator, often the same environment as coffee. Hawaii is the only state that can grow cocoa beans. They're far enough south and it's warm enough that they can cultivate it. But most of the cocoa beans grown in the world, about 70%, are grown in West Africa. So the Ivory Coast, Ghana, Nigeria, and so they produce the majority of the cocoa in the world, and most of it is commodity cocoa, and so the quality isn't the highest, and it's usually purchased by the shipping container load by large companies like Hershey, Nestle, Ghirardelli, the big names that you've probably seen in the grocery store shelves. And generally, those cocoa beans can have a pretty monotone flavor. Like there's not a lot of nuance and fruity or floral characteristics. And sometimes they have defects as well, so they often roast the cocoa beans at a fairly high temperature to kind of cover up those defects, and that gives it a little bit of a chocolatey, sometimes burnt and bitter, single, I would say, monotone flavor. We work with a different type of cocoa beans, and they're generally referred to as fine flavor cacao. I may say cacao and cocoa interchangeably, they're synonymous. But we have cacao from Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, Guatemala, Bolivia, Colombia, Ecuador, and Tanzania. So mostly Central and South America, and then we have one from Africa with Tanzania. And they generally have a lot more potential, is a good way to put it, than commodity cocoa beans. So different origins of cocoa beans have different flavors. So it's depending on the species, how they're grown, like soil, rainfall, sunlight, all those things. Just like wine and coffee, the environment that they're grown in has a big impact on the flavor. And so in the craft chocolate world, we talk about single origin chocolate, and so that's kind of a reference to having cocoa beans from one country specifically to highlight the flavor and the differences of the cocoa beans coming from different places. So most West African cocoa is very chocolatey. That's a term used in the flavor world. For instance, Madagascar cocoa beans are very fruit forward and have a bright cherry note. Ecuadorian cocoa is usually pretty nutty. And so there's a lot of different flavors depending on where it comes from that influence the final product in the chocolate. They say about 70% of the potential of a chocolate bar is based on the cocoa bean. So that's why it's really important to buy high quality, fine flavor cocoa beans if you're going to make a high quality chocolate bar. So when we receive cocoa beans, the first thing that we do is we will open up it comes in like a big 50 or 70 kilogram sack, kind of like you've seen coffee beans probably. This is a dried cocoa pod. And so when cocoa grows on the tree, it's kind of funny looking because it grows on the trunk instead of growing off of a branch. And this is being dried, they're usually about twice this size, so they kind of look like a football. And in the inside, you can hear there's cocoa beans rattling around. So there's usually 40 to 50 cocoa beans per pod. And I did the math, and most of our chocolate bars require between 40 and 50 beans to make one bar. So on our scale, one bean equals one chocolate bar. So if you think of that on a global scale, there's a lot of cocoa out there. So after the cocoa pods they start out green on the trees, and as they ripen, they turn yellow or purple or reddish, depending on the species. Some are more bulbous and round, some are really long and skinny, depending on the species. But after they're ripened, they will cut them open with a machete, and on the inside, the cocoa beans, they'll pull them out. They're kind of all connected together like a cluster of grapes, and they're covered in this slimy white pulp. And in the Spanish-speaking countries, they call it baba, which means drool. So it's this really sweet, slimy mucilage that covers the cocoa beans.
Kind of sour too.
Yeah, there's a little bit of tang to it as well. Yeah, so if you ever get a chance on vacation somewhere and get a chance to try fresh cocoa beans, it's pretty crazy. The beans themselves aren't very tasty at all. They're very astringent, very sour, very bitter, and they're actually purple naturally. But after the beans are harvested, they'll pile them up in these big boxes and they start to ferment. So great things are fermented in life. So cheese, wine, beer, chocolate, kombucha if you like that. So the cocoa beans, this slimy white pulp has a very, very high sugar content. And so when it's introduced to native bacteria or yeast, it'll start to ferment. And that slimy white pulp will start to kind of liquefy, and the sugars will convert to alcohols. And the cocoa beans will undergo a chemical transformation inside, and they'll convert from that strange purple to the conventional brown color that we're used to seeing. One cool thing that we have at our chocolate shop is there's a product called cacao fruit juice. So there's a company in Ecuador that collects the draining during the fermentation process, and then they pasteurize it and export it. And it tastes nothing like chocolate, but it comes from the same plant. So we use that in some of our drinks and cocktails. It's almost like tangy pineapple juice.
You said it comes from when they're fermenting?
Mm-hmm.
Don't
Yeah.
they ferment it out on the ground?
After fermentation, they're dried. So some places do it differently, like a lot of under less developed countries, they don't ferment in big wooden boxes. They will pile them up on the ground and cover it with banana leaves. That's a more traditional approach in African countries, but a lot of Central and South American countries, they use boxes. And so they're like 1 meter cubed boxes. It holds about 1,000 pounds of wet cacao. And it'll ferment for 3 to 5 days. And during that process, those sugars convert to alcohols. They start to dry out a little bit. And, sorry, alcohols to sugars. And then once they're fully fermented, they'll take them out and put them on a big patio to sun dry, kind of like they do with coffee as well. Or sometimes they have raised beds with like metal mesh so that they can get some airflow underneath it, and they'll put those in under like big greenhouses, depending on if it's a rainy environment or not, because if it starts raining while you're drying your cocoa beans, it's kind of pointless. So after the beans are fermented and then dried, then they're bagged up and ready for export. So all that happens in the country of origin before we even get them. And then once we receive the cocoa beans, we usually buy up 1 pallet at a time, which is about 1,000 pounds. We'll put them out on a big table and sort through them, because along with cocoa beans, there will be twigs or leaves or pebbles sometimes. We've even found some string. So there's a lot of stuff that sometimes comes in the cocoa beans that we don't want in our machinery or in the chocolate at the end. So we hand sort them first, so that's kind of the first step in quality control. And then the next step is roasting. So roasting is where we, as the chocolate makers, can kind of put our imprint on it in terms of the flavor. We generally roast at a lower temperature for a longer time than industrial chocolate. Anywhere from 35 to 55 minutes is how long we roast our cocoa beans. We have kind of a modified rotisserie oven that we had a welder build a drum, so they tumble kind of like a clothes dryer. And in the roasting process, we're doing a few different things. Developing flavor is probably the most important. It's also drying out the cocoa beans a little bit more. They generally arrive at 5 to 7% moisture. And if y'all have ever worked with chocolate before, you know that moisture is the enemy of chocolate. Like if you've got some melted chocolate and I don't know, if you're sweaty and some drips in, that can cause the whole bowl of chocolate to seize up and it'll turn into this thick, gritty fudge. And that's because cocoa has a very high fat content, and fat and liquid don't like to get along. So we're drying out the cocoa beans. It also sanitizes them a little bit. Being in a jungly environment and during the fermentation process, sometimes there's flies around them. So the outside of the cocoa bean often does have some microbial activity. So in the roasting process, it reaches a temperature threshold to kill off most of that. And then lastly, as the cocoa beans are reducing their moisture, they kind of, as they're steaming, they kind of puff up as the moisture is escaping. And then after we are finished roasting, we'll put them on perforated sheet trays and cool them down quickly, and then they contract, and that separates the inside from the outside more easily. So the cocoa bean has this thin, wispy shell. I'll walk around so y'all can see it. So the shell is very like leafy and almost like dried leaves in terms of the texture. And then the inside of the cocoa beans are called nibs, and the nibs are what we want for chocolate making. The shell portion we don't want because it's very fibrous, and it could make the chocolate chalky and gritty. And however, we have discovered that the shells do have some flavor and aroma left in them. So instead of pitching them or using them for mulch, we realized that we can make a tea out of it. So after they're roasted, we brew it like a loose leaf tea, and it's very chocolatey, but it's kind of light at the same time. And then if you sweeten it a little bit, it's almost like chocolate sweet tea. So here's cocoa nibs and cocoa shells. So you can see the difference. This almost looks like dried up leaves from when you're raking the garden in the fall. So that's the roasting process. And then this separation of nibs from shell is called winnowing. And instead of doing it by hand, which would take eons, we have a machine in which the roasted cocoa beans, they're in like this hopper, and then they get crushed up and then it enters a vacuum system with some PVC pipe and a shop vac. And being a lot more dense, the nibs fall through the vacuum system, and the shells, being really light and wispy, get sucked up. So it separates the good nibs from the unwanted shells via vacuum density separation. So kind of neat. A lot of chocolate makers have a very rudimentary setup with a shop vac and PVC pipes, just like we do. So on a craft chocolate scale, that is pretty normal. And then after we have clean cocoa nibs, well, yeah. So these have been roasted, and you guys are welcome to taste these if you'd like. These are crushed roasted cocoa beans, fairly chocolatey, no sugar, kind of bitter, crunchy. So you can taste those if you'd like, or just kind of check them out. They smell very great, a very aromatic, chocolatey flavor. Once we have clean cocoa nibs, we need to grind those down. So that's what this little machine is doing here. We have 3 at our shop. 2 of them can do 100 pounds at a time. One of them does 50 pounds. So this little guy does 4 pounds, and so it's kind of just a baby version of our big scale equipment. We can produce about 300 pounds of chocolate per week at our shop. So it's tiny compared to, you know, a Hershey's or Nestle or something like that, but we've grown quite a bit since we started back in Fayetteville in 2014. We used to make about 40 pounds a week, so we've done about 7x in terms of our production capacity. So it's pretty cool to, you know, to grow organically as a small business. So the cocoa nibs will get crushed by these grinding machines. Have a granite stone base and then 2 granite wheels, and just the crushing, shearing force of the weight of those stones, it will pulverize those cocoa nibs into a liquid. So cocoa beans are roughly 50% fat naturally. So if you ever see fat-free chocolate, beware, there's no such thing. And sugar-free chocolate's kind of iffy. Some people make it with stevia or xylitol or sugar alternatives, but to me, the real deal's better.
Sure.
Yeah. So the cocoa nibs, once they are put in this grinder, will start to liquefy into what's called cocoa liquor. It's not alcoholic, that's just what they call it. So we will grind our cocoa nibs for about a day to liquefy them, and then on the second day we will add our sugar. So we use organic cane sugar as our sweetener. It's got a little bit of honey tone to the flavor. Plus, it's being organic, it's a lot better for the environment and maybe our bodies as well. Refined white sugar is not vegan, and a lot of people are interested in vegan things. I learned that refined white sugar is whitened with bone char, so it's like roasted cow bones, and in the process of making the sugar, like charcoal, it absorbs all the color. So it sweetens the same way, but there's a little food for fact. So we'll add the sugar to the grinders as well, and the sugar actually takes much longer to refine and reduce the particle size than the cocoa nibs because it's a lot more dense and crystalline. Those guys are, you know, half fat, so they liquefy pretty easily. But a batch of chocolate will spend about 5 to 6 days in these grinding machines for the 100-pound batches. These guys, the smaller ones, I can do in about 18 hours to 2 days. But the big full-scale batches take about 5 to 6 days to reach that texture that's super velvety and nice and smooth on your tongue, where you don't feel any of those gritty particles. If you've ever had gritty chocolate, it's likely that they didn't grind it long enough, or that in the winnowing process they didn't remove enough of the shell, because the fibrous shell can make the chocolate kind of chalky, gritty, unappealing like that. And so for our chocolate, we only use 3 ingredients: cocoa beans, organic cane sugar, and organic cocoa butter. So this is cocoa butter. It's a saturated fat, so it's solid at room temp. A lot of y'all probably have it in your skincare products, but we also use it in chocolate making. Actually, cocoa butter and cocoa powder is kind of an interesting process how they make it. Once these cocoa nibs are ground down into a liquid called cocoa liquor, like I mentioned, in big industrial scale places, they will pour that cocoa liquor into a hydraulic press, and using many tons of force, they will push the fat out of it, and so that's cocoa butter, and what is left is a cocoa powder cake. So when you get cocoa powder at the store for baking with, that is refined cocoa nibs that have all their fat taken away. So it's kind of a...
They can't get it all out.
Right, it's still 10 to 12% fat usually. Yeah, but it's kind of an interesting combo that the skincare industry and the chocolate industry are best friends, because the chocolate industry has all this extra cocoa butter from whenever they sell cocoa powder, and a lot of lotions and cosmetics use cocoa butter because it's kind of a miracle fat in that it melts right at 98.6, so it melts right at body temperature. So that's why it's so good for lotions and makeup. So after we've ground our chocolate for 5 to 6 days and we've reached that point at which the texture of the chocolate is velvety smooth, what we're looking for is less than 30 microns. So it's about, I think it's like 1/8 the diameter of human hair. And that's the point at which your tongue doesn't feel any texture. So once we've reached that point, we'll dump the chocolate out into big pans, and then we'll put it in the fridge to set up, and it'll solidify into these big 15-pound bricks. So at that point, the chocolate is just kind of waiting to become chocolate bars. It's kind of on hold. We can age it, and it's pretty stable. It's not going to degrade by waiting in that point. And then the next step in the process, sorry, I wish y'all could like be at the chocolate shop and see all this cool equipment going, because it's kind of hard to conceptualize. The next step in the process is called tempering. And so that's one of the more technical, scientific portions of chocolate making. So what we're doing is we will melt the chocolate down so that it reaches a temperature that all of the cocoa butter melts and liquefies. Cocoa butter has 6 different fat molecules in it. And in the tempering process, what we're doing is we're melting it so that it all liquefies, and then we cool it down in motion, and then the cocoa butter starts to recrystallize, and that allows it to have a stable structure. So 5 of those 6 fat molecules are a solid at the point at which it's in temper. And that allows us, when we make chocolate, it'll have a nice shiny, glossy finish. It'll snap when you break into it, and it also raises the melting point. If we were to make chocolate bars like straight out of the grinder, although it might be smooth texturally, it would be kind of dull and crumbly once it sets up, because that's the cocoa butter molecules setting up in an unstable manner. So we'll mold chocolate bars. I'll show you guys. With our tempering machine, it deposits the chocolate into our molds, and then it vibrates out the air bubbles, and then we put them in the, you can see here, this has a nice shiny finish on the top, and then this particular chocolate bar has, this is for looks, it has caramelized pecans and salt on it, so this is one of our 2 milk chocolates. But you can see how it has a nice shiny finish, and that's the result of proper temper. If you've ever worked with chocolate at home, where you melt chocolate down and then maybe use it to dip strawberries or do some other stuff, when it sets up, sometimes it can be kind of streaky. That's called fat bloom. So that's also the cocoa butter solidifying in an unstable manner. So tempering is really important for chocolate bar making. One way that you can kind of get around that appearance if you're making chocolate at home is you can add more fat to it. So sometimes they'll say like to melt chocolate chips and then add a little bit of coconut oil to it. If you up the fat content, you can help the cocoa butter not set up in that funky, streaky fashion. So there's a little home trick if you guys are ever working with chocolate at home. So yeah, we'll mold the chocolate bars, we'll pop them in the fridge for about 20 minutes just to set up, and then we will wrap them in that biodegradable vegetable plastic sleeve, and then we wrap them all in their paper exteriors, and that's chocolate making. It takes about a week to go from unroasted beans to sort it, roast it, winnow it, grind it, temper it, mold it, wrap it. So it's a long process, but it's worth the wait.
Oh yeah, it's shiny.
So I did bring some samples of all our chocolate bars. I know that's probably what we've been waiting for. But before that, does anybody want to have any questions about chocolate making? Or
do you give tours at the store?
we do, yeah. So you can come by and throw on a hairnet, all look like lunch ladies, and see the chocolate making process from start to finish. Yeah, there's a thing on our website about signing up for a tour. It is pretty small though, so we can only do like 6 to 8 people at a time. Our shop is like 1,400 square feet, and half of that is like seating area. So the kitchen itself is pretty tight. Yeah.
Do you teach everybody that works there how to make it, or do you and your partner just make it, or?
So generally when we hire folks, I kind of give them the rundown of chocolate making. Depending on what we hire them for, we may go into more detail. Like we have one girl that's primarily a baker, because we do cakes and cookies and tarts and all that kind of stuff. And so she knows it more in her head than in practice. There's one of the girls that's been working for us for a couple years, Kayla. She's kind of we're kind of the tag team for chocolate making in terms of doing the.
She's a long-haired girl that works there.
She's
kind of like Preston Dunn.
kind of like what?
Preston Dunn. Like, she's an actress, I don't know. But she has like
Short hair?
Yeah.
That's Sarah.
Oh, okay.
She's kind of the manager of the bar. Like
She was just super knowledgeable. Like me and my husband went in and we talked to her and then another guy, and they just seemed to know like a whole lot.
yeah. So yeah, I trained Sarah to be like, she's our director of chocolate experience. So when people come in and they're first timers, she kind of ropes them in and says, "Hey, have y'all been in before?" And then kind of gives them the rundown if I'm not available. So we realize that I can't be Mr. Chocolate all the time.
I noticed you didn't say anything about cocoa beans from Honduras. Is there a reason why?
We don't have cocoa beans from Honduras, but they do grow there.
Yeah, because as a matter of fact, I was talking to my cousin about 3 weeks ago about cocoa beans.
Yeah.
I have a cousin in Honduras, and he showed me charts of all the production of cocoa beans.
Cool.
So I was wondering why you didn't, because he said they're very, very good quality.
So we've partnered with a couple different organizations that do the importing and the exporting from cocoa, for cocoa beans. And the primary one that we work with, they don't have any representation in Honduras, but there is another website called Chocolate Alchemy, which is kind of the homebrew chocolate organization that I was mentioning earlier, where you can buy cocoa beans, cocoa butter, small scale equipment, and they do carry beans from Honduras. I think it's called the Wampasuri district.
Yeah, he told me about it, but I can't remember it.
Yeah. So yeah, cocoa beans, they grow pretty much anywhere in the tropics. Cocoa grows. So most of the Caribbean islands, all of Central America, from Mexico all the way to Costa Rica, most of South America except for like Chile and Argentina, it's too far south, and then all of Central Africa, Rwanda, the Congo, Burundi, Tanzania, and then West Africa, the Ivory Coast, Ghana, Nigeria, Chad, Togo, they all grow cocoa beans. Madagascar isn't really in the tropics, but since it's island, it's tropical. And then also Southeast Asia grows a lot of cocoa beans. Indonesia is a big commodity cocoa grower. India is kind of up and coming in the cocoa production world. And then Vietnam cocoa beans have actually won a lot of awards recently. They have a very kind of woodsy, spicy flavor. So it's kind of neat to taste different origins, and you can almost, if you taste the chocolate blind, if you've had enough of it, you can almost say, okay, I think that's probably from there. Because they have some regions have very distinct flavor profiles, and no matter how you roast it, you're going to end up with a spicy flavor or a lemon peel. Like Tanzania has a very tangy, lemony flavor. So
is that how you determine how to pair it with the flavoring?
So yes, some of our bars we do add stuff to it. Our 3 origin chocolate bars, the Bolivia, Dominican Republic, and Haiti, are just cacao, sugar, and cocoa butter. So the flavor notes are just inherent to the cocoa bean. We don't add any flavor. We only have a couple of flavored bars. So our mocha is a coffee milk chocolate, and then the lavender bar has lavender, honey, and vanilla, so it's very floral. But we more do our flavor pairings with desserts than the bars themselves. Yeah. because there's a little more flexibility in like investing in the packaging. We bought like 10,000 of every wrapper, so it's like, it's kind of a big deal to pull the trigger on a new packaging. So before we did that, when we rebranded from Hello Cocoa to Markham and Fitz, there was a couple flavors that we wanted to keep around that we really liked. So lavender, Dominican, and mocha we brought along. We used to make our sweeter chocolate from Uganda, but the cocoa beans they weren't very high quality. There was a lot of debris in them, so it took a long time to sort through to get rid of the flat cocoa beans or the leaves and twigs. And so it took extra time, and then it also reduced the yield of what we were actually paying for. So we switched to Bolivia for our sweeter, like entry-level dark chocolate. So that's the one I often convert people to dark chocolate from, too, when they're like, I don't really care for dark chocolate, it's kind of bitter. I'm like, let me, just wait. And so we also made a milk chocolate after much request. So we got connected with a nonprofit, and they do work in Nicaragua. So all of our cocoa beans for these 7 bars are through an organization called Uncommon Cacao. And so they work in Guatemala, Belize, the Dominican Republic, Haiti, Colombia, Bolivia, and maybe one other country. But it's a for-profit entity, but the nonprofit called Enliven International we got connected with, and they have, kind of chosen this area in central Nicaragua near Matagalpa and to help increase their income. And so looking at the natural resources, they saw that the cocoa beans that they had there weren't really being maximized in terms of the quality that they were producing. So they've kind of come along and helped train them in terms of the fermentation process, when and how to harvest. And so now, instead of selling their cocoa beans on the local market or just snacking on it themselves, they've increased the quality enough that it's now appealing to craft chocolate makers here in the States and in Europe. So they're actually getting a lot more money per pound than they used to be. So it's kind of an economic development thing through this nonprofit. Yeah.
What do you think is the difference between the company you guys had in Fayetteville to how big it is now? Because I know a lot of people, my age and younger are really raving about it, and there's a lot of talk about it. So what do you think is the difference between then and now?
The location is a big deal. When we were down in Fayetteville, the spot we were in was kind of across from the old smokehouse, if you guys are familiar with that. And it wasn't a retail, we were in a little office complex with a bunch of offices. And so it really wasn't a destination. It was more of a place where we just produced chocolate, and then we had to go sell it. So we had to either wholesale it to grocery stores or coffee shops or boutiques, or do farmers markets or craft fairs or festivals like that. So it was a lot more wholesale centric. And Lauren and I, we always, like, my favorite part about being in chocolate is sharing not only the taste, but sharing the process. And so doing stuff like this is really fun for me. And so whenever somebody would come to the shop, I'd be like, hey, do you want to see how we make it? Put on a hair net, let's go. And so now that we have a space that is very retail centric, it's all the wall, like in the kitchen, it's all glass. So you can, like, when you walk in, not only are you hit with a nice aroma of chocolate, but you can, like, see, oh, there's a pallet of cocoa beans. Oh, there's some chocolate machine spinning. I wonder what's that doing? So it's a lot more experiential. And that was one thing that was really important to us from the early get-go. We wanted to have a space where we could kind of share the craft chocolate experience with customers. And so last spring, when we met with the developers of 8th Street Market, we kind of pitched them an idea of a, kind of a transparent, interactive, almost dessert bar, chocolate factory concept. And they were like, perfect. Because the whole concept behind that development is kind of like food transparency. So the kitchens to Brightwater, the culinary school, have a lot of glass, so you can see them making stuff. We've got a lot of glass. There's going to be a lot more foodie things coming up that are, it's not like, oh, it came from a truck somewhere and now we're selling it. It's like, we're making it here and you're enjoying it. And freshness matters, not only in produce and meat, but chocolate as well. So, and another thing is the aesthetic of the place. So the old place that we were in was like an old Mexican restaurant. It had like stucco walls and it was very hodgepodge. And so being able to design a space from scratch, like it was an empty box, and we got to fill it in. Lauren did a great job in terms of picking out, you know, color schemes and textures and materials, and I didn't really realize how important that was, honestly. But once as we were like picking out, you know, our fixtures and displays, I was like, you know what? I know it's more expensive, but we should probably go ahead and get the marble tables. And she just gave me a big old hug. She was like, I'm so glad you finally see it now. And but like, I didn't realize the Instagrammability was such a big deal, because we haven't really paid for any marketing, but people come in, they take a picture with their chocolate bar with our wallpaper in the background, and so it being like visually pleasing made much more of an impact than I realized. So I would say that's one of the biggest reasons why it's a buzz. Somebody over here, yeah.
Could you please tell me the hours your dessert bar's open?
Sure, yeah. We're closed on Mondays, and then Tuesday through Thursday, we are open from 12 to 7. Sorry, 10 to 7. And then Fridays and Saturday nights, we're open from 10 to 11 p.m. And then Sunday, we're 10 to 4. But that's likely going to be changing soon, because we're realizing that a lot of people are coming like right around 7, like when we're kind of closing. So we're getting a lot of like after dinner traffic, being a dessert bar, which makes sense. But we didn't really know, you know, how long we should be open. Like in terms of staffing, it's like, do we open it? Do we want morning? Is there going to be a lot of morning traffic since we're selling coffee and croissants, or is it going to be more like dessert? So it's leaning. It turns out after being open for 4 or 5 months, people are coming more in the evenings. So we're likely going to transition that to more like noon to 9, but we're finally going to be putting like some decals on the front windows to tell you that. But you can always Google it. Yes, good question. That's a lot of people are like, I never know when y'all are open. So, and then also another thing, it's kind of tricky to get there at the moment, which is pretty unfortunate since we just opened a business. But 8th Street is under major construction, and so you can either sneak through the Come and Go parking lot at 8th and J, or come the back way, like from Walton, on the Walton side of Rogers or Bentonville, and then come east up 8th Street, and then you can get there more easily. So, sorry about that, but I blame it on the city. Yeah.
So you keep your website current then with hours?
Mm-hmm.
You can find
Yeah.
that when you change things?
Yeah, website, Facebook and Instagram should say it as well, and then
Yelp is a good one.
Huh?
Yelp.
Yelp, yes. Yelp keeps up with us somehow. I guess that's more like customer driven, but Yelp. What else? So I've got some chocolate to taste.
Let's give Patrick a round of applause.
Hey!
Chocolate.